Good evening. I welcome you to our PoSoCoMeS seminar. Today we are discussing the book The Complexity of Evil by Timothy Williams. In his book, Timothy Williams provides an answer to the question, why do people engage in genocide? And he does it by drawing on various scientific fields such as political sciences, sociology, criminology, anthropology, social psychology, and history. He also develops a model that explains perpetration across different cases, such as Holocaust, the genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda, and the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia. Timothy Williams, is junior professor of insecurity and social order and the chairman of the Risk Research Center, both at the University of Bundeswehr in Munich in Germany. He was a PhD candidate and postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Conflict Studies at the University of Marburg, also in Germany. He is a vice president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars and a member of the executive board of the German Association for Peace and Conflict Studies. His research deals with violence, focusing on its dynamics and its consequences for post-conflict societies and the politics of memory. We also welcome our discussant, Jonathan Leader Maynard. Jonathan Leader Maynard is a senior lecturer in international politics in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London and a parliamentary academic fellow advising the International Affairs Unit of the Parliament of the United Kingdom. His core research focuses on the role of ideology in politics, in world politics, especially in mass atrocities, armed conflicts, and political extremism. Timothy, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alina, for the kind introduction, and to you and to the working group for your invitation to present my book. I'm very happy to be here. When I was in Cambodia, sitting in front of a building in a Cambodian school, speaking to the head teacher of this school, who was an interviewee of mine, a former Khmer Rouge Chlop, a militiaman. At one point during the conversation, he said to my translator, Kiao Duong, and myself, when we joined the Khmer Rouge, it was like we were entering into a tiger zone. So we had to become a tiger like them, so we had to be immoral like them, cruel like them. Whatever was ordered needed to be completed. And in this book, I'm trying to find out exactly why people decide to become these metaphorical tigers, to understand why individuals participate in genocide. So of interest in the book is, to me, are low-level perpetrators. So I'm not looking at the people who invested with larger amounts of power, giving the orders or commanding the situation, but the foot soldiers, as it were, who implement genocidal policies. And I think it's important to ask the question of these lower-level perpetrators, because in the end, we can't really understand the dynamics of violence and how it actually manifests itself without looking inside the black box of the genocidal perpetrating machine. And it lets us understand the complex realities on the ground while genocide unfolds. So to answer my question of why people participate in genocide, I developed, as the book suggests, the complexity of evil model, which is obviously explicitly referencing Hannah Arendt's iconic phrase of the banality of evil. And with this reference, I echo Arendt's break with an interpretation of the Holocaust perpetrators being psychopaths or ideological fanatics or any other ways aberrant, but instead, as Arendt puts it, terribly and terrifyingly normal. I take up this notion of the banality of evil and develop the idea of the complexity of evil by arguing that individuals' motivations to participate in genocide are indeed banal, but they're also manifold and complex. And the complexity of evil model systematically differentiates between different types of motivations, facilitative factors, and contextual conditions. And I argue that we need a sort of this sort of complex causal approach to really understand genocide motivations. At the same time, none of these factors themselves are particularly extraordinary, and they reveal less about the depths of human depravity than highlight simple and everyday reasons why people participate. Many of the factors that I will also highlight are factors which motivate other action in other parts of life. This is obviously not the first endeavor into looking at perpetrator motivations. There's been excellent work on the Holocaust and on Rwanda before, a little bit also on Bosnia, Cambodia, and Armenia. But I try and marry this work, which is very focused on individual cases, with broader work from the fields of social psychology, political science, criminology, organizational sociology, and other disciplines, to try and bring together these insights. And often different disciplines are talking about similar kinds of things, but try and marry their language together to bring everything into conversation and synthesize it. Before I introduce the model itself, which is really the core of the book, maybe a couple of words. I think it's important to emphasize that the model appears, I have a graph which I'll share in a second, it looks quite static, but it works because what I'm trying to explain is not why someone becomes a perpetrator in and of themselves as a person, but I'm trying to explain individual actions of perpetration. We can talk about this more in question and answers if you're interested in it. But in the end, I very firmly believe that it's important when we're studying violence to look at the motivations for specific types of actions. And this, for example, also differentiates me from a more recent book by Let Smoilers, who looks very much as sort of types of perpetrators. And in this, motivations and the facilitative factors and contextual conditions can change over time. It can be dynamic, and individual people's motivations can change over time. But each time we can use the model that I have as a heuristic to try and understand why people are participating. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to. There we go. There we go. Let's go straight to that slide. There we go. I'm guessing you can see the slide now. If it's in presenter mode, I apologize. But you could, I hope it's big enough for you to be able to see. Right. And sorry, I lost the screen. You can, yeah, okay, you can still see that. That's good. Now, I basically differentiate between three different types of factors. I have motivations, which guide individuals in a choice between alternatives, which are both socially structured and individually constructed. That means that they are conditions which are necessary to be present. We need at least one motivation for someone to participate, but it doesn't matter which of these motivations it is. And to understand why people participate, we obviously need to understand how the individual themselves is seeing their situation. It doesn't matter whether someone isn't being threatened objectively, it matters how they are constructing the situation and how the groups around them doing it as well. Here I differentiate between in-group motivations, out-group motivations, and opportunistic motivations. In-group motivations are focused on the perpetrator group itself, whereas out-group motivations focus on the victim group and attitudes towards them. So within the in-group, we have various different examples. For instance, a hierarchical influence of people being obedient to authorities. We have conformity pressures or peer pressure horizontally amongst peers. But we also have, which can both these horizontal and vertical relationships can be laced by coercion with threats of violence. And if you remember back to the quotes that I had about the Tiger Zone, here we also have an example of someone taking on a role and how this construct the idea of a role. In Rwanda, we had people wanting to be good Hutus and taking on this role and embodying that being a motivation to participate. One example here is the obedience to authority. This has its social psychological foundations. There's a lot of research on that, but a lot of it goes back to, quite problematically, Stanley Milgram's famous series of experiments, which tries to explain this obedience to authority. In the Holocaust, the nature of this authority was inherent to the military, SS, and police structures in which most of the killing apparatus was embedded. There was an order structure, a hierarchy, which had to be obeyed. Importantly, for instance, in the Holocaust, coercion was possibly important subjectively for the people perpetrating, but objectively, there was little threat. No one was actually killed for not participating in the Holocaust. But this type of obedience can take on other forms in other cases. So, for instance, in Rwanda, authority was localized much more strongly in local dynamics. And local leaders could claim this authority, sometimes referring to traditional forms of, for instance, mandatory collective work called muganda, that allowed leaders to present killing as a form of collective activity. In Cambodia, site of most of my research for this book, there was ONCAR, the organization of the Khmer Rouge, that wielded absolute and uncontested authority, where the orders of any superior would take on law-like character, and there was an uncontestable hierarchy, which was pretty much absolute. So I hope that this example sort of shows that it's the same factor working across the three different cases that I look at, but it'll be imbued with different qualities in different places. Opportunistic motivations as the third type are really quite important. It's when people hope to benefit themselves from their actions. And these benefits can be quite rudimentary and basic, anything from material benefits for being paid to do it, or for getting bonuses, being able to loot, or to rape, but also ideas of people engaging in personal conflicts with others under the mantle of genocide. So getting rid of a long-held enemy by accusing them of being an enemy. So the motivations are really the core of the model. But, and this is where I sort of try and systematize the literature a little bit, I say that a lot of things which people talk about as motivations are actually not causally really that. They're not needed for someone to participate, but they do make it more likely. And that's what I call facilitative factors. And so they make participation in genocide easier. But they themselves, if we just have that, then they wouldn't be sufficient. So an example of something which is cited a lot in the literature as is important is dehumanization. But this in and of itself is not really sufficient for someone to participate in genocide just because they see a victim as dehumanized, but it does make it a lot easier to kill them when they do. Yeah, and here, one example could be from, I had sort of divided into ideological factors which justify and legitimate the killing, moral disengagement, in sort of group factors within the group, and how time plays a role. In moral disengagement, basically, just as an example, I can't go into all these factors in the 10 minutes that I've been allotted to speak, but I hope that a few things I'm saying will sort of give you an idea of at least some of these factors. In moral disengagement, it allows the perpetrator to undermine moral concerns about participation, resolving cognitive dissonance that they may have had between their morals and the actions of killing, which most people find difficult, and distancing themselves from this moral judgment. So a prominent factor here could be creating physical distance from the killing, or emotional distance, or using sanitizing language during the killing process. For example, an example of the sanitizing language was when a former guard of S21 prison in Cambodia said to me that the victims were killed like ducks and chickens. So this is at once sort of a dehumanizing language, but also the way that it was framed in the interview as it was part of a routine killing of animals. And lastly, we have contextual conditions. These are macro level background factors which provide a context which is conducive to or hostile to participation in genocide. And here, this is, I think, a really important framework to understand that a lot of these factors are really key. It's really important how the state is structured, what authority structures there are, what ideological what ideologies there are circulating, what how the enemy is being constructed, whether they're being seen as threatening, how this ties into perceptions of uncertainty. These are all constructed at the macro level through national and regional elites, but they manifest down in every social situation. And they provide the context within which the perpetrators understand their environment and in which they act. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I've given a very broad strokes overview of the book. I look forward to Jonathan's comments, and if anything was too short, then I'm happy to speak more on it later.
Right. I guess that's over to me. I hope people can hear me okay. I should apologize. I should just say I'm not at home at the moment. I'm not in my home country. I'm abroad, so I'm using a cafe. So if there's occasionally some background noise, then apologies in advance for that. First of all, I mean, Tim's book has been out for a while now, but I want to congratulate him on its release. And I thought I'd just start by highlighting kind of 2 or 3 features of the book that I think make this a particularly important contribution to scholarship before I then just ask Tim a few questions. This book really, as its title suggests, embraces complexity, moving away really from an era of social science that I support Tim and think that we've done a good job of moving past, where people were sort of seeking, to some extent, the most parsimonious models possible of social phenomena. There are reasons to seek parsimonious models of that kind, but there are also real costs to limiting social science and kind of the humanities and other disciplines to the search for parsimonious models. So Tim's model is still a model. It's still a somewhat abstract representation, but it is one that tries to get a better balance, I think, between complexity and revealing abstraction. The other thing that makes this book very, very special is how close to empirical reality it is. Tim's one of the very, very few people in the world who has actually sat down with the perpetrators of genocide and asked them to explain and talk about the events they experienced and their own actions in their own words rather than just from a distance. And that's obviously one of the hugely rich features of this book. And Tim adds to a kind of welter of scholarship that increasingly emphasizes, through this kind of close work with perpetrators, the relatively ordinary roots of what is nevertheless the most extraordinary form of violence that we see in world politics. So that's just some compliments for Tim. If he wants to pick up on any of those in a minute, he can. But Tim, I wondered if to start with, you could say a little bit more about your understanding of a model and what the book's sort of trying to achieve. You use the word in your talk just then, and also in the book quite a lot, that the model is a heuristic. And what it isn't, or at least what it seems like not to me, is what some social scientists would seek in a model is a kind of predictive model, a model that tells us kind of like point predictions about exactly what is going to happen in genocide, although it does, I think, have some implications that we might call predictions. But I just wanted to start with, you might say a little bit more about why you talk about in this book, why you focus on contributing a model and what you mean by that model being heuristic.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, so what I understand as a model is exactly what you said. Like I understand it's a heuristic as in a framework for reducing the wild complexity of empirical reality into something which is manageable and is comparable. So it's supposed to be a heuristic which helps us to understand and to be embedded within various empirical contexts. So it's not so abstract that it's sort of can explain everything, but it's also not as embedded enough that all I can really do is explain the 58 former Khmer Rouge who I spoke with, plus all the secondary literature which flowed into it. And what I hope it can do is, well, the aim is not for it to be able to be predictive, to say, okay, we have this situation, what's going to happen? I don't think at the micro level, many models that we have out there can really realistically do that at all. But instead, to be used by researchers who are engaging with perpetrators and with genocidal situations to lay over their empirical data and to be used as a helpful tool to understand why people have been motivated to participate. So it's a sort of a framework. And I did see across the cases that I was looking at that there were differences between the cases in terms of how strongly certain aspects were prominent in specific locations. So obviously, when we're looking at motivations, what I'm trying to explain is one individual's perpetration, and that will vary within Cambodia. Different people had different reasons. We can also see patterns within Cambodia which are different from Rwanda, and I think that this is then useful. So, and I haven't done the research in Bosnia or in Guatemala or in other places, and other people haven't either. But I believe that the model would be a useful starting point for people to have conversations with perpetrators and to try and understand why they did what they did. And just maybe one last word on the prediction. I very much doubt that we will be able to have sophisticated models which can predict the occurrence of genocide with any level of accuracy anytime soon. We have excellent work going on, which is getting quite good at being able to identify risks of atrocities. Although from year to year, they look quite good at predicting what's happening. But then the next year, suddenly they are happening in other places. But those models are getting more sophisticated. But those are drawing on huge amounts of data at the national level. If we go down to the individual level, I don't think we're going to realistically have the amounts of data to have any predictive modeling anytime soon. And I think it would be quite worrying if we did have that kind of data available to us. But, very final word, I do think that these insights can be used for prevention rather than for prediction. So if we know that there's going to be a genocidal situation, we know what kinds of aspects of that situation are most likely to influence perpetrators. And so we can try and influence those. So we won't know who's going to participate, but we can try and stack the odds against people being motivated.
So if I can just follow up on kind of the first of those sort of two functions that you see the model as kind of playing as a sort of what I might think of as a kind of analytical sift for kind of thinking through perpetrators' motivations. And you mentioned indeed talking to perpetrators. And I was wondering, obviously, you've got the typology of the different motivations, the different facilitative factors, the different contextual factors. Could you just reflect sort of a bit on how far do those sort of match perpetrators' own words about their actions? As I said in the sort of intro, you know, you're one of the few people who's really talked to perpetrators in their own words. Do they talk in terms of things like coercion, ideology, economic opportunism, or are these kind of, you know, would they recognize those terms as describing the motives or the conditions around them? Or is this model kind of at a remove from perpetrators' own ways of speaking? And if that's the case, why is that? What's the sort of different way in which perpetrators sort of describe their own actions in your experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Jonathan. No, these do not match the words with which the perpetrators are speaking about their perpetration. So these are, and this is partially because it's supposed to be a decontextualized model, right? So it doesn't use the cultural framings of different types of, say, authority or ideology or what a group will mean quite explicitly, because it wants to work across different cases. So I think maybe the best example would be the idea of status. Status is a sort of as a concept which is imbued with meaning in very different ways in Germany, in Cambodia, and in Rwanda. But it will have, it has an impact in each of these, where sort of saving face and hierarchies are extremely important in Cambodia. This is not the case elsewhere. So people will talk a lot about gaining face, losing face, and so on and so forth in Cambodia. And I will then hear that, and I will I have transcripts of most of the interviews, and then I analyze them using qualitative content analysis. And then I'll match those with sort of more analytical terms that I derived from the literature, and I also contribute to the literature. And I think, I mean, in the book, I try and I refer to interviews a lot. I also use a lot of direct quotes of interviews. I want to give them sort of the space to also use their words. I also included between each of the chapters vignettes of perpetrators, so telling the life stories of individual people who participated in genocide. So I tried to let them have their own words, but at the same time, I don't think it's useful to necessarily use their specific language for such an analytical model, which is supposed to be comparative. If this were just a sort of a Cambodia focused or just a Rwanda focused study, then it might be, or it would definitely be different.
And in that respect, Tim, I mean, as you know, people talk a lot about the uniqueness of cases, right? And you know, the uniqueness of the Holocaust, and in many ways, indeed, you kind of describe in the book that one of the reasons you sort of started with Cambodia is actually because it's rather different from other cases. So beyond just the sort of general, I guess, you know, you've justified very well the value of having some degree of abstract model that can talk beyond the cases. But in the course of your research, were you sort of more struck by how different these cases were that you were examining in terms of individual level motives and solicited factors and contextual conditions, or did you think actually when we really look hard at these cases of genocide, there's just an enormous amount of commonality between these dynamics? Or is neither of those quite the right summary? Is it something more complex than either, that genocide perpetration tends to be fairly similar across cases or tends to be fairly different?
Yeah. Every case is unique. Every case is also comparable, as a sort of a summary to my response to 40 years of debates on the uniqueness of the Holocaust. But I think there's a lot of value in comparing the cases because the cases are so different. So like you said, I chose Cambodia because it's very different to Germany and Rwanda, which are the two which had never been compared themselves, but there was a lot of research on the Holocaust and on Rwanda. And like I said, the way that these things are spoken about are very different in each of the cases, because they're embedded. Case studies will embed themselves much more strongly in the language of the perpetrators or of the victims, and use frameworks which are more common to those cultural settings. And so I think the value of the book is that it uses a slightly more analytical level, which allows them to be compared with each other. So I think the importance is that the cases are different, but if we're looking at the individual level, it's quite remarkable how strong the commonality is between the different cases. There are certain factors which are important again and again, with a couple of exceptions. So social dynamics within the group, particularly between peers, is absolutely fundamental to how genocide becomes implemented and why people participate. It's about what other people within the group that you're either friends with or who you're stationed with and so on think. And it's what they're thinking as well. It's how ideologies embed themselves and the sort of the roles that ideologies can play without making people ideologues, without people becoming anti-Semites or anti-Tutsi in and of themselves, but adhering to these frameworks. That happens again and again. But for instance, when we look at Cambodia, social dynamics were very different. It was a totalitarian regime. Okay, Nazi Germany was also a totalitarian regime, but it was even more totalitarian. There was no sort of moment in a person's day where they could speak freely. There was the private sphere was completely abolished. And there were sort of reflection sessions which people were mandated to participate in which they needed to reflect on their own failings and the failings of others. So there was basically an institutionalized denunciation culture. And this led to people obviously not building up trusted ties to their comrades, but fearing them. So the dynamics there are also very important. What other people think, how they perceive you, and that's also motivate and guide people's actions, but in a very different way. I think that would be like one of the biggest differences.
Great. One of the kind of, I would say, features of your model that intersects with other important debates is ultimately, although you tell me if you think I'm wrong, but ultimately motivations are the heart of your explanation, right? Like you put more emphasis on them, albeit complex combinations of them in minus conditions and so on and so forth, but motivations are the focus. And then you have facilitative factors and you have contextual conditions which can shape how things go on, but they're not, as it were, the necessary conditions for action. And I wonder if you could just say a bit more about why that is your approach or that's your intuition. It does seem to me that, you talk in the book about kind of dispositionist versus situationist explanations. I feel that there's even beyond the kind of particular social psychology debate that might be familiar to some people in the seminar, might not be unfamiliar to others. I'm not proposing we go deep into that. But there is a kind of, I think, broader approach to thinking about violence, which is essentially very unmotivational, right? It really says violence is explained by the conditions people find themselves in, the small variations in individual behavior, sure, but we're not so interested in that. What's really going on to engender it here is the situation, right? And you're saying something more subtle than that. So why in the book did you feel that, in a sense, you needed to push back a little bit on the side of motivations and say that that's really kind of what should be at the, literally in your diagram, at the center of the picture?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. Motivations are at the center. I think it's important, though, that the diagram wouldn't work without the facilitative factors and the contextual conditions as well. Particularly contextual conditions, they're sort of the framework within which everything happens, and the motivations can't even unfold themselves. So it's a bit of a banal statement to say that nothing happens in a vacuum, but it's really important that nothing happens in a vacuum, because that specific context and the way it's created makes the motivations even work. The facilitative factors are a little bit less important, and I think there I'm pushing back against sort of a lot of the literature which doesn't make that causal differentiation. Just says anything which could have an impact, we're going to just say as the motivation. I'm trying to basically degrading the facilitative factors causally. They're very important because they don't have the same causal impact. They're very important. But it's a really interesting question to say, okay, we've sort of gone beyond the dispositional approaches to motivations, and if it's all situational, then do motivations really even matter? Because everyone acts the same way in different situations. It's not the bad apple, it's the bad barrel, as it were. I don't think that. Right. I mean, I think that it's quite important that there are patterns within perpetrators which are social psychologically explained, and we do see higher rates of people participating if they want to be conform with a group and so on and so forth. But not everyone works that way, and different people react to situations in different ways. So this idea that you also referenced of interactional approaches to understanding participation is important. And I think that there has been, over the last 10, 15 years, a decided focus on social psychological explanations, which is great and important because they are really fundamental. But what has been lost a little bit there, and because they're often situationist, it sort of becomes more of a sort of fait accompli that people will then participate. But there are lots of other factors as well, and they do interact with other factors. So, for instance, opportunism is really key to a lot of people. People may participate the first time because their comrades are participating and are pressuring them to do it. The second time, that may not be the reason. The second time may be because they realize that they could loot, or they really want a next warm meal Cambodia, for instance. So here, it's also important that it's a dynamic model, that we're thinking about individual actions and how those can change over time. And I think the social psychological factors are often key at the beginning. They'll also continue having a relevance, but their weight could shift. And so for me, it's important to center these motivations, because in this diversity, I think we can learn quite a lot about shifting situations. We can learn about also when the situation changes, what does that mean? What kind of motivations can even still work? And from a prevention perspective, I think that's really key.
I'm conscious I don't want to sort of take up too much time with our discussion. We should turn over to the audience in just a second. Maybe, depending on how much time we have, I can come back to them later. Just one last question, Tim, from me. I just wonder if you want to say a little bit more about what, since finishing the book, you've been doing, specifically in this area, like what's been the sort of the aftermath of the complexity of evil for you, and how has it been linked to the work that you've been doing going forwards?
The aftermath. Well, I mean, I've been, as you said, the book's been out a couple of years now, so it's I've been doing various things since. But I think there are two things that I'd like to highlight. One is that I've been working more on, also beyond genocide, looking at perpetrators of other types of violent crimes, and I think that there's something to be said. There's some value, and I'm looking particularly at riots and particularly at digital dynamics of riots. And I think that in the 21st century, it's really important to understand that violence is happening in very different ways. And while that sort of, everyone says that, in research, we very seldom actually think about what that actually really means. And because social dynamics are so key to why people participate in genocide, and I would argue more broadly in violence, and social media, as the name says, are sort of key for those social dynamics. I think we really need to start interrogating that. I'm trying to do that a little bit with a little bit of success, and quite a lot of unsuccesses along the way. And the other thing that I've been spending more time working on is looking at memory, which in this working group I think is quite important, of perpetrators, and how the construction of various actors in the aftermath of genocide as perpetrators, as victims, as heroes, and so on and so forth, and how these violent actions are remembered has really important consequences for power and for legitimacy in post-violent societies. And so, and thinking about what culpability means, what agency means, is really tied into our understandings of motivations. It makes a difference whether someone can say, I didn't have a choice, I had to do it, someone gave me an order, and a society believes them or they don't believe them. And then it sort of matters for the people who then stopped the genocide, whether these narratives are believed or not. And so I've been and I'm in the process, just 8 days into a sabbatical, to finish my second book on the politics of memory, and how these roles are constructed and how that plays into legitimacy and power. And I really think that what I did in the first book, trying to understand why people participate, now how is it remembered societally why people participate and what it meant, what they did, is really sort of importantly tied. And yes, that's what I've been doing for a few years, and that I've been doing again in Cambodia and Rwanda, this time with my own field research in Rwanda as well as Indonesia, which is a new case for me. But it's very interesting.
Oh, amazing. I mean, that sounds great. And as you say, very relevant to this context, this seminar's focus. I'll just say that it was a privilege to go back to the book. I had already read the book, but go back to the book for this session. And I really, again, recommend it to everyone. It's a great read. And is it freely available, Tim, or is it online now, open access?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for making that. I'll put a link in the chat. It is open access, and it costs the foundation a lot of money to do that. So it's nice if people do go download it for free.
So you have no excuse, anyone, not to read this book. But anyway, thanks, Tim, and congratulations again on the release of a really terrific achievement. And I'll pass back to Alina.
Thank you very much for a really interesting discussion. And now we have a possibility to ask questions. You could either ask questions directly or just write them down to the chat. And I will give the question to Tim and Jonathan. And thank you very much. It was really interesting. Okay, we have a first question. Just, I think it's possible just to switch on the microphone and to ask the question, isn't it, Daria?
Hi, is it me?
Yes.
Alina?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this. Just to follow up, such a brilliant book. I love this book so much. So just doubling down on Jonathan's endorsements. Thanks so much, Tim, for this. Obviously, Tim, your case studies are built on the 20th century, and I know that you're doing some work looking at the role of Twitter, I guess, formerly Twitter, now X. I was just wondering if you were to do a similar sort of case investigation into 21st century conflicts and the advent of technologies, to what extent would you change or integrate other factors at play given the digital space? Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rhiannon, for a great question, and thank you for your rave of the book as well. I think I would do a lot very similarly, but I think that the results would be imbued with different meanings. So I think that the idea that in-group dynamics, that within a perpetrator group, out-group motivations towards the victims and opportunistic motivations as self-interest would does still hold in a digital violence setting, as well as hybrid violence, where we sort of see an importance of offline physical violence and digital discourses as well. I do think that that would be a useful framework for looking at it. But what's changed maybe is, who do we see as these groups? So probably the definition of the victim group won't necessarily have shifted, but who is seen as a perpetrator group? Who is the us in this situation might have radically changed. I think in some degrees it will have become smaller. We see much more much tighter definitions of who is us, and they're much broader definitions of who is them, with increases in sort of polarization, particularly in right-wing spaces. And that will then also have, but what will also have consequences is that there's much more immediate communication. There could be much more, I think there's much more potential for peer pressure, for coercion, and so on and so forth, by being able to sort of see what other people are doing much more clearly. The fact that violence now is often being live streamed, with people being very clearly in place or not in place. What I think is, I mean, also important to think about is, what does this mean for different people's roles? And this is, I'm giving a conference presentation in a couple of months' time, and I'm only just started thinking about it, but what do these roles that we have of perpetrator, victim, bystander, and sort of hero or rescuers, the sort of the four categories that we've had for decades for physical violence, what do they even mean online? And I think to a certain degree, they can still be imbued with meaning. We can still think about that, but is everyone then a bystander? Maybe sort of Rothberg's idea of implicated subjects might be more useful there. And I think there are some things to think through here. But I do think that if I'd have done this, I mean, I started this work in 2013, and I did the field work in 2014 and 2015. So it's a while ago now. But I think if I came to the topic and decided not to work in Cambodia, but to say work on Myanmar, or on Islamic violence against the Yazidis, or to look at atrocity crimes happening in the Middle East now, I think that would also be like, we'd see different kinds of dynamics. It would be a different case study, but I would hope that the model would still be useful in understanding it. But that would be I'd love to do a study which looks at it more from the digital and hybrid perspective. I think you wanted to say something else.
Just a two-finger on that. I love that idea and I'd love to hear more about it. But in terms of the online spaces, the victim, bystander, perpetrators, rescuers, heroes, I think what the online space does differently is all these invisible enablers, which is of course the big tech companies and the motivation that they have to then sort of react to this in a way that essentially fulfills their profit margins, because they want engagement. So I wonder if the digital space has this other person. We can talk more about that offline. I just was curious.
I think that's really important though, because there's always this larger context, right, which the contextual conditions are framing, but very frequently the people shaping that, the context in which it's happening, are thought as macro level, national and regional elites who have they have a security agenda, they have an ideological agenda, they may have an economic agenda, and so on and so forth. But it's all sort of tied in with the violence. As a means to an end, right? And there is an end. Whereas the tech companies, it's a means to the violence itself is just, it's something useful to keep people on the platform, and so it serves a very different purpose. And so the context is being shaped by parameters which are quite independent of the violence itself, but so important in shaping it, because the way the algorithms work, as we've sort of learned over quite harshly over the last couple of years, is so important to what is seen, what is not seen, and how polarization plays out. So yeah, I think that's a really important point on these invisible enablers. A lovely term, which I will steal. I'll cite you on.
Thank you very much. We have two more questions, one from Sandra Montoya and one from Montasia Kabab. I will start with Sandra's question. Thank you for your presentation first. I wonder if you could elaborate on the applicability of your model to analyze the conflict in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be very, I believe it would be useful to study the conflict in Gaza. I think interviewing militants of Hamas, as well as IDF soldiers, would be fascinating, and I think that we would be able to understand very well their motivations for participating in their respective forms of violence. So I think it would be great to do a study with Hamas to understand why people decided on the 6th of October to the next day get up and do what they did, but at the same time, why within a nominally democratic setting IDF soldiers are participating in atrocities. I think these are big questions which the world is really quite bitterly fighting about in various different ways. What the violence itself means, but why individuals are participating in it is definitely an open question. And I do believe that the model would be useful in understanding that. Yeah, and I think the factors that I was highlighting would be applicable there as well.
Now we have Montasia Kabab. Would you like to ask your question? We just can't hear you at the moment.
Now it's better?
Yeah, it's better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The human rights experts at the United Nations have called on the international community to prevent genocide in Gaza since November. And as you may know, South Africa has taken Israel to the International Criminal Court of alleged genocide. And today, and they think this week, it will start the against Germany from Nicaragua. They take Germany to the International Court. I only want to hear your opinion, after 33,000 murdered person and with 14,000 are children. Do you think, your personal opinion, this is a genocide, or do you think, from your experience, it can really be genocide or not?
Well, okay, it's not really the topic of the book. I deliberately skirt, actually. I took out of the first version of the book, I took out any discussion of what definitions of genocide are and what violence means. But as a genocide scholar, I have dabbled in thinking about whether various different cases are genocide or not. And I think it's extreme. I am not an expert of Gaza or Israel, and I find it very hard to make these estimations from what I read in the news. But what I will say is that I think that, well, I'll say two things. The first is, I think we're seeing very large-scale violence against civilians, which is extremely worrying. There are definitely atrocity crimes occurring. But I'm not sure whether what's key to genocide is the intent to destroy in whole or in part, in this case, a national group, whether there really is on the side of Israel the intent to destroy the entire group, or whether this is a form of illegitimate atrocity crimes which are intended to punish the group but not destroy it as such. And I think that there are some very worrying statements by political and military leaders which could suggest that there is intent to destroy. But I wouldn't want to say conclusively that that's what's happening. But there are a lot of very worrying signs. The second thing I'll say, though, is that what I'm seeing, and I recently wrote a blog with a couple of colleagues on this, is that I think that in the discussions we've been having for the last couple of months politically, which have become so heated, we're really missing the point. I don't think it really matters. I mean, of course, it matters whether it's genocide or not, legally, but sort of for our public citizen perspectives, it doesn't matter really whether it's crimes against humanity or whether it's genocide. What really matters is that people are dying and that should stop, right? I think it's really important. It has different consequences what kinds of crimes it is. But from my perspective, I think a lot of this discussion of is it genocide or is it not genocide actually is a distraction from the really important analysis of the warning signs we're having that that hunger is being used as a tool of war. Which the destruction of the conditions of life is part of the genocide treaty, right? So that could be something which is important, but it doesn't matter then whether it's genocide or not. What really matters is that there is violent action happening which needs to stop against civilians, right? And so I think that for me, this whole debate of is it genocide or is it not is really a smokescreen that is quite distracting from the really important political questions.
Thank you very much. We have more questions in chat. We have one question from Anna Katila. I was wondering if I could type my question here, considering the ethical complexity of researching perpetrators and concerns of giving a platform to excuses and ongoing denialism. Could you reflect on how you navigate these challenges in your research and how you talk about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So talking to perpetrators is, like Jonathan said, a bit of a tricky endeavor. It's people are not always excited to talk to one about it, but obviously, it's for me. I approached more people than I spoke to. I only wanted to speak to people who were genuinely interested in telling me their story. And from that, it's important that I wanted to see the world through their eyes. I wanted to understand, as a qualitative researcher, their subjective perspective on what they did. And that involves hearing them excuse what they did, them denying certain things happening. And I don't have to agree with what they're saying. And for many things, heard abhorrent things, which I, of course, personally don't agree with. But as a researcher, I accept those as what I would like to hear them say. I want to see the past through their eyes. And then I think the importance there is to then contextualize that in any publications that I am doing, and not just sort of parrot back what they're saying, but to then say, okay, they say they had no choice, but what does this really mean in terms of the context that they're in? And like I was saying earlier, Holocaust perpetrators frequently said they had no choice, and no one was ever killed for refusing to participate in the Holocaust. They were maybe sent to the Eastern Front, which, as we know, was also, I mean, a lot of people died there as well, but no one was executed for not participating. So people saying, if I did not participate, if I hadn't shot a Jew, I'd been shot myself, that's patently wrong. again, it doesn't mean they don't necessarily believe it, but for many people, there's a different degree of that. And that, I think, as a researcher, is sort of partly my my role. Yeah, I mean, it's not always easy, and I think it becomes more tricky in the publication where, like Jonathan said earlier, I'm trying to represent these people, and would they recognize what I've written? On an analytical level, they wouldn't necessarily recognize their words because I'm using a social scientific language. And normatively, I have a different stance to several of the people who I spoke with. I think Cambodia is a very specific case in the sense that most of the people I was speaking to didn't portray themselves as perpetrators to me, but as victims. That's not so specific. That happens in other cases as well. But they're also societally accepted as victims. And it enabled them to be able to frame their experiences as perpetrators through the lens of victimhood. And so there was less reason for denialism. And there was enough rationalizations and excuses there. But yeah, it's an empirical challenge to deal with.
Thank you, Tim. We have another question from Sandra Montoya. Do you see cases in which victims of genocide are likely to get involved in practices of genocide due to the trauma and dark experiences as perpetrators, to join as perpetrators?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, this does happen that people who have experienced as victims have had terrible experiences will then themselves become perpetrators. The mechanism through which I think this is most likely to work is that it'll inform the way that they see other people. So their worldview and how the outgroup is being constructed will be heavily influenced by this. I think that trauma can potentially influence. I mean, it'll definitely also influence the trust they have within their in-group, what security means to them, what insecurity by an out-group means to them. What I don't think there's a sort of an automated version through which trauma becomes perpetration. Well, I don't know. I know that isn't the case. And people who are traumatized are not automatically more aggressive or anything like that. But it can also, I would assume that this is something which can play into sort of over time can play into certain motivations. But again, I think it would mostly be through the way that the outgroup is perceived and how the context is seen as more insecure.
Thank you. We have a comment from Lemis. Of course, it matters, I think, is connected to in the context of genocide in Gaza or not genocide in Gaza. Lemis, would you like to ask a question, or it was just a short comment to the discussion? Just a comment, okay. Yes, do we have other questions in the audience, from the audience?
Maybe I can just...
We have a question from David, yes?
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Excuse me.
No, it's fine.
It seems your methodology of source collection was to make a snapshot of their memory at the moment you spoke to them. We who work with memory documents have encountered that malleability of memory dependent on the subject's status as witness, accused, or victim, and across time. How did you account to the shifting sense of your source base? It's a question from David Rich.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, obviously, any work with perpetrators is always based on memory. There are some ego documents that diaries, letters by perpetrators from some cases. But the only ones of any note which have been used in research have been from the Holocaust. And they're relatively few and far between. And so it's an imperfect source. You're quite right. What I think for me, what makes the data that I've collected useful beyond useful despite these problems is that I didn't sort of launch the conversation by saying, why did you participate? What motivated you? And then code their answers. But what I tried to do in the interviews is to, over a longer period of time, talk to them about their everyday lives during the Khmer Rouge period. So I would understand a lot about how their lives worked, who were they interacting with, what were they doing, what were they involved with, how did they see their situation, and so on and so forth. And so, and then when we're talking about violence, they would sort of embed that in these large narratives. And so when I say that it's peer pressure, this is not necessarily someone said I had to do it, but it could have been that within the narrative, someone was telling me about this situation, and I will then interpret from what they're telling me that it's social dynamics at work there. So it's less that. So of course, people's memories of these situations can shift. But I hope that by them telling me very explicitly about a lot of situations that they're involved in, rather than explicitly asking them for their motivations, at least some sort of that malleability will be avoided. I see that you had a follow-up. Maybe I'll just read it out, Alina. Did you compare their oral stories with any statements that they had given in truth and reconciliation processes or tribunal processes? Did you have opportunity to revisit them across time? So I did not compare their oral stories with statements given in other processes. And that's because I was working in Cambodia, where there has been, there has been a transitional justice process. It's been a very expensive transitional justice process, but there have only been 3 people who have been tried and sentenced by a tribunal. And there is documented. So I did compare it with some documentation in truth and reconciliation processes at sort of an NGO level. So I would see oral histories which had been collected by NGOs. And sometimes I knew that they were from the same people that I'd spoken to. I would never say who I had interviewed, but sometimes the NGOs had that in their sort of archives. So I knew I had spoken to that person. Unfortunately, most of the NGO oral history projects and the documentation they have is relatively sparse. The training conducted before to people collecting these stories was extremely rudimentary. So there was very little opportunity to compare that to any level sources. A couple of low level former Khmer Rouge did testify as witnesses. But only one of the people who I spoke to was also a witness at the tribunal. I have had other projects since which have looked at civil parties at the tribunal, and among them there are also several former Khmer Rouge. But that was sort of a different kind of project. And did I have the opportunity to revisit them across time? Yes. So I was only, my fieldwork was only 6 months, but I tried during those 6 months to return to people and uphold conversations and continue conversations with people. So it was only in 2014, 2015 that I had those conversations. I've not returned. I've returned to a couple of them since, but for the bulk of the people, it was just over a 6-month period. It would have been great to continue going back to Cambodia again, but that was not unfortunately possible at the time.
Thank you, Tim. Did you want to get to the comment, back to the comment from Lamis about the Gaza situation before, as I interrupted you?
Not really. I mean, like I said, it does matter whether it's genocide or not for many reasons. Like it has legal implications, it has discursive political implications. But my point wasn't that that those are unimportant. My point is that for the reality of what should be important is not, is it genocide or is it crimes against humanity or is it war crimes? That again, it does matter for certain things. What it doesn't matter for is that to try and combat violence, all of those need to be combated. It doesn't matter how we label it. It should be less discussion about what we label it and more discussion of how it could be avoided. Yeah. But I don't need to talk about Gaza anymore. I'm not an expert on Gaza.
Do we have
2 cents that
excuse me? Do we have any other questions? We have Anna and Ryan have to go and say thank you for a discussion. If we don't have any other questions for the audience, I would like to ask a question. Why do the people stop on a micro level? Because, you know, on the meta level, you have some intervention, but are there any kind of processes that does make the people stop committing genocide or atrocities? On the macro level? I'm not working on the micro level, so it's interesting because it's a kind of different dynamic where you are deciding. Yesterday I took part on this, and then today I decide to stop.
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. I would answer it with two statements. First, I can't really answer that question because people don't stop in the model, because the model is always for action. So the motivations would always shift anyway, right? So if someone participates today, why they participate tomorrow is maybe a different motivation. So, if people don't have a motivation, then they won't participate, right? So it's really a sort of an absence of motivation. But I think what you're maybe getting at more is, are there factors which are inhibitive of people participating? And I think that those they do exist, and I gloss over them terribly in the book. I think it's really actually quite important to think about what factors, and this would have been a good answer to Jonathan's question of what I've been doing. Well, I haven't been doing it since, but I've realized since that what I should also include in the book is more on why people don't participate, and why people are inhibited or allow or manage to not participate, because some people don't want to participate and manage not to. And I think these complex discussions of that are very much missing in the literature. I have one PhD student who's working on de-escalation dynamics in mass violence, trying to understand why do conflicts not escalate into genocide. And he's doing really interesting work at the meso and the macro level. He's not really looking at the micro level. But I think to add that kind of thing into that there, how people can sort of, we have it a lot in terrorism studies, right? People sort of de-radicalizing. Well, I think we have to be very skeptical of a lot of that literature. But yes, that's not really something that I've engaged with in the book, sadly.
Thank you. And I have one probably last question today. You told that you would like to use the model to prevent genocides or atrocities or violence. But you also told that there's different situations because the correlation with a culture, state, model, and things like this. How, I don't really understand, how can you use it for different situations, a prevention, when on micro level, when is the correlation
the context
with
so
the culture or the context
yeah.
so different, and then when you are just looking to the micro level, not to the meta level, but it causes more, this correlation causes much of differences. How do people act?
So yeah, that's an important question.
It would be easier in German.
No. Like it's a great question. Like, because most prevention and also for that matter, most dealing with the past is sort of out of the toolbox, rubber stamps, where we do the same thing in every different context. And that's what's not allowed to happen, right? So you can't take the model and say, what we learn from this is that we really need trust building, or we need self-confidence boosting for people to say no, right? And we should do exactly the same seminar in Rwanda, Cambodia, Germany, Syria, and so on and so forth. That wouldn't work. What we need to do is say, okay, what factors are most important in motivating people, and how does that work in this specific context? And what kind of program could we develop which would impact that? So if we think, for instance, that social pressures between peers is most important, then what we need to do is we need to think, how does that work in a specific cultural context? And in Cambodia, I can tell you social pressures work very differently to how they do here in Germany, where I live. And so we would need very different kinds of programs to push back against that. What it means to how we can combat ideological frameworks, or to shift understandings within ideological frameworks, will mean very different things depending on what the ideology is. But we know that the ideology is maybe important, and people's worldviews can be shifted, and we then just have to develop programs which will react to that. So it's not easy, but I also don't think that prevention can be easy, and anyone who says that it is, and that they have a recipe which is going to work everywhere, is probably more intent on getting your money than actually preventing violence. So yeah, forgot we were being videoed.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? I don't see other hands nor messages in the chat, questions in the chat. So thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you very much, Timothy, for joining us today. Thank you very much to our audience for staying with us and asking questions, taking part on the discussion. You can find, as always, the video tomorrow or the day after tomorrow on YouTube. You can, if you would like to see it again, or yes. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening.